Again, reach your arms up overhead if you like. Let out any sounds. Oh. And welcome. I was listening to an actor that I respect, kind of a actor who's been around for a while, who was talking about when he first started acting and just how anxious and how nervous he was. And in one of his very, very first productions, he was a spear carrier. He had, he just was sort of there holding a spear. His second part, he had one line. And he was so freaked out. He just kept saying to himself, don't blow your line. Don't blow your line. Don't blow your line. Trying to calm himself. And so in the dialogue happening on stage, it was his turn, and he stepped forward in a very dramatic voice, blurted out his line saying, don't blow your line. That's kind of what happens when we get overrun by anxiety and fear. Again, we're talking about this as the second round. And it's such a fascinating thing around changing your relationship to fear and anxiety when it arises. It's so, so profound. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the specific techniques that can be helpful when you use fear and anxiety as this doorway to new possibilities. Recently, I gave a talk on starting over in your life, and a lot of people responded to it. And it was very interesting for me because I realized that for many of us, this idea of like starting over or starting again is exciting, but it's also can be terrifying at the same time. And every time we encounter fear, anxiety, whether it be low-grade anxiety or high-grade anxiety, it becomes this very interesting practice of how to move from threat to opportunity. So what I'd like to cover in the little bit of time I have here with you is a review of some of the essential elements of how fear and anxiety show up in our lives, the importance and the incredible practice of turning to investigate fear in your body, when how it shows up in the felt sense, but also to talk about the importance and significance of investigating fear in the mind. And then we're gonna explore kind of a classic practice for transmuting fear into new possibilities. I have a lot of really wonderful, humiliating stories about my relationship with fear and anxiety. And I was just reflecting once, just recently, when I was, I think, maybe a sophomore in high school. My father was a professor of English, and he took a sabbatical. And they bought a VW Westphalia camper in Germany and spent 8 months traveling in Europe. And I was going to join them for a month in Great Britain. But first, I went to Geneva to visit a classmate. And I just had a wonderful time for a week in Geneva. And before I left, my parents said, look, whatever you do, don't miss the flight because we're going to be jet lagged and we have to get on to the next thing. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind. And being 15 or 16 years old or whatever I was, and being, as they might say in Geneva, chien sans laisse, a dog without a leash. We did a lot of late night carousing. And as I was getting ready to fly into Heathrow to meet my folks and my younger brother who'd be traveling with them, my friend explained to me how to catch the bus and so forth. And I immediately got to the bus stop and was overwhelmed by all the options and got on the wrong bus. And then after much, much angst, I got on the right bus. But I sat there on the bus watching time passing and trying to calculate if I could still make it. And I remember so clearly sitting on that bus in Geneva with this clench in my chest, feeling kind of sick to my stomach, feeling sweaty, feeling my pulse elevated. And I remember so clearly as we were just driving up to the airport, I watched my plane lift off and fly away. You know that feeling. I'm sure you know that feeling. That something's off, something terrible's going on. And it shows up as fear and anxiety. And there are three levels of fear and anxiety, and I'm sure there are more, but just for simplicity's sake. The first is sort of the general concern of life. It's the basic, walking down the street, don't die, don't die, don't die. The next level is where it gets a little bit more obsessive, a little bit more compulsive. And this is where we kind of move from that low-grade anxiety to a little more of unrelenting anxiety. And you just have that subtle clench of like something's wrong. There's a sense of hypervigilance and kind of an inability to sort of put it down. The next level, I think we could categorize as trauma. This is when you feel so much fear, anxiety, and helplessness that you get locked in. And classically, you either get locked into freeze, or you get locked into flight or disassociation, or you get locked into fight, some form of just an aggression that takes over. So anytime you perceive threat, your prefrontal cortex shuts down. You go into immediate survival. You start looking for very simple solutions that are going to get you out of whatever's going on. And you lose your capacity to look at all your other options because you are so locked into survival. So threat mode is basically where you are just trying to stay alive. And then the inquiry here is it possible, and how? What's the mechanics? What's the science? What's the art of moving from threat mode into opportunity mode? Because when you are in opportunity mode, here's the fear and the anxiety, but the prefrontal cortex is actually engaged. You have this sense of where the prefrontal cortex is sort of the self-soothing capacity of the mind, where the mind will say, this is pretty grim, but you've survived this before. When you're in opportunity mode, you have access to long-term thinking as opposed to short-term survival. And in opportunity mode, you have more of an evaluative function. You're still in the moment, but you can realize, okay, what are my options right now? You actually have some choices in your life. When fear and anxiety goes unchecked, we live under a constant sense of threat. And when we're under a constant sense of threat, it's incredibly debilitating. Your nervous system gets in hypervigilance, you get worn down, you lose all sense of possibility in your life. And so we have this experience of what we could think of like healthy fear and anxiety and unhealthy fear and anxiety. The healthy fear is looking out for things that might kill you and making suggestions to you as to what you might avoid. The unhealthy fear and anxiety is sort of that fixation where you lose your capacity to sense opportunity. You lose your capacity to sense your options. So under threat, and you may know the acronym of fear, of false evidence appearing real, you are just caught in a sense of stasis. So when you're under threat, it's really helpful to look at how you can shift into a mode that's more responsive, less reactive and more responsive. And there are a number of strategies for doing this, and I'd like to explore a couple with you that have helped me a lot, and I think might be helpful as well. And the first has to do of kind of the art and science of exploring fear and anxiety in the body when it arises. And I think a common fear for many of us right now is the fear of what's going to happen in the future. And for others, it's very personal. For others, it's a little more general. And when we're under threat, and I love this model, and this is from the Sedona method. And there's a whole story about this, but I have found this to be helpful, these distinctions. That when you start to turn to investigate your anxiety, when you turn to investigate fear, it has a tendency to show up in three different ways. One is having to do with survival. Do I have enough money to get through life? What would I do if I lost my job? What would I do if I get sick? Will anyone be there to take care of me when I'm old and feeble? Or any time when your sense of physical survival is threatened, or any sense of your identity, when your identity is threatened, it has to do with a very primal kind of clench. When your life is threatened, physical or your sense of identity, there's a very powerful grip, a very powerful clench inside. So that's one manifestation. The other has to do with the fear of losing control. And this is a really interesting one. What happens if our country goes into anarchy? What happens if there's a collapse in the economy? What happens if global warming goes berserk? All these things that we anticipate that are beyond our control. When we fixate on those and when we're under threat mode, again, we get locked down. The third has to do with the fear of losing love and relationship and attention. What if I really said what I thought at work and I got ostracized? What if this person that I'm living with rejects me? What if I did something and I lost all my friends? So it's very interesting, and I have found this to be helpful when I feel fear and anxiety, to ask myself, is the root of this survival? Is the root of this the fear of losing control? Is the fear of this the fear of losing attention, affection, and love? Sometimes asking that question can help you get a handle on what it is. And if you explore the Sedona method, which is a very interesting technique, basically what they say is once you identify that, and once you identify what it feels like inside, then you ask yourself, well, can I let it go? And there's a series of questions you go through, and just very, very briefly, I'm not doing justice to the work, but you ask yourself, could I let this go? And quite often the answer is no. Then you ask yourself, well, if I could let it go, would I? And that becomes a really interesting question. Well, cool. If I could, would I let it go? And the third inquiry is, well, when will I let this go? So you're sort of streaming attention toward the possibility of actually letting it go. So there's also a real art to turning your attention to how fear and anxiety in the mind lives in the body. The old line, your issues are in your tissues. And I was with someone a while back who was kind of struggling at work. He really wasn't liking his work anymore. He'd been at it for a long time. He'd achieved some success, but he was kind of topped out. He kind of hit the glass ceiling. And he was reporting to someone he didn't like. And he felt stuck. He said, I'm too old to quit. And also something really difficult came up at work. There was an ethical issue that came up, and in his opinion, management was way on the wrong side. but he didn't feel like he could rock the boat by bringing it forward. So here he was. If I speak up, I could be fired and ostracized. If I don't speak up, I'm not sure I could live with myself. I'm too young to retire and quit, and I'm too old to start over. So as this was just sitting with him, he naturally felt himself more and more kind of caught in this fear and anxiety. The survival element was there, like, what am I going to do if I don't have this job? The control was there, the fear of losing control. If he really spoke up, what would happen? And in losing attention, affection, and love, the people he was working with, the idea of being ostracized, there were all elements there. So sometimes a very effective way of working with fear and anxiety is to really explore moving from the story to where it lives on the inside. And you may be familiar with the RAIN meditation. The R is to recognize or realize what's presenting. The A is to inquire as to whether you can accept it or allow it. Sometimes you can't, it's too much. The I is to investigate. And primarily that's a somatic investigation. And the N is to explore what it's like to nourish what you find. So I asked him if it was okay to do a little somatic investigation of this, and he was okay with it. And as he just thought about his predicament, he began to report out just a feeling of tightness inside. He could feel kind of a clench around his heart, around his sternum. He could kind of feel his throat tightening up. And one of the things you can do in this practice is, as you await and just sense, like, how does this issue live on the inside? Can I locate it? Is that when you begin to kind of sense what it feels like, you can explore if there are emotional words that resonate with that feeling. And so when he was exploring the tightness, the tightness around his chest, I asked him if there was an emotional word, and he said, just frustration, I guess. And another interesting thing you can do when you're exploring the somatic investigation is you can verify or validate whether that word is really true. And so I just said, well, when you go back into that tightness in your chest, does frustration, is that the right word? Does that word resonate? And he paused, he kind of went back in, he goes, no, that's the wrong word. I said, this is resentment. And so we explored what resentment felt like, and that had a much more of a tight, kind of like bitter, a really, really bitter feeling, as he described it. More of a condensed, kind of congealed knot, like almost like a fist in his chest. Part of this practice of exploring how an issue lives inside is just getting familiar with it. So I invited him to imagine he was just sort of sharing a park bench with this feeling, not trying to fix it or figure it out, but just to kind of be with it. And then I asked him, when you trace back this feeling, like how old is this feeling? And he had a memory. He said, wow, where did this come from? I just remember going into law school, going through the whole process of applying to law school, because my father was pushing me, and how resentful I was. And so we kind of just sort of, as he named that, we took some time again just to be with it, just to be with that very young feeling, like, however old he was, like 21 years old, and feeling pushed. And he kind of just made room for that, and we explored the nourishing. And then the nourishing is a challenging process, but it's calling on loving presence, compassion or kindness, and I kind of invited him to kind of bring his hand to his heart, which is a really kind of a wonderful somatic thing to do anytime. And I just invited him just to, what would it be like if you could bring a little bit of kindness or compassion to this? And he said, well, I can feel it softening, but I don't want to soften this. Softening means this is just resignation. I don't want to give in to this feeling. Another question you can ask is, well, what does this feeling inside need? And he said, it just needs attention. And he explored to what it was like to just to see it, just to make room for it. And as he just sat with it, he saw how scared he was. He continued to offer it compassion. And he could feel eventually kind of a softening, kind of a sense of softening and letting go. And part of this practice of rain meditation, it's recognizing, it's allowing, it's investigating, it's sort of nourishing, but then it's also just sort of being with whatever is there afterward. And so he kind of sat with that for a while, and I asked him, what advice do you have to give yourself? There was a long pause, and he said, well, you know what? There are people I can talk to about this ethical issue. And there are some good people at work. And he said, I don't have to live for my work. There's a lot of stuff I love to do in my life. And I've just been living to work. What if I actually work to live? I've shut off all these things I enjoy. And there are some options. So he had moved from threat to opportunity, where he actually was able to recognize that there were people he could talk to. There were some doorways he could follow around this ethical issue, that his relationship to work, there was a possibility of that shifting in some way. Obviously, there's more work for him to do. But to me, that's just such a wonderful story of turning to have tea with your demon. Turning to, and we can think of demons as energy, just that energy of fear and anxiety. So you might explore at some time when it feels right for you, when you feel fear, when you feel anxiety, to name it, to sense if you can really be with it. And this is an important thing, because sometimes it's really not right. It's not the conditions aren't right for you to really be with something, because if you kind of like move in to look closer at it, it might actually trigger you more. It might flood you more. So I always find when you ask, can I be with it? Ask really, really carefully and listen to the somatic feeling in the body, and you'll get a sense. Okay, I can hang out with this a little more, like, not now. And what you may find is another time when you have more energy. Maybe if you're accompanied in an investigation, that might be the best time. Whenever we explore fear and anxiety, it's so important we have a kind of a sense of center. We feel resourced. We talk a lot in this practice of like developing the witness, your capacity to observe without preference. But finding a way to be with fear and anxiety is super, super helpful. So I recently had an event where I was feeling a lot of anxiety. I wouldn't call it fear, just sort of like your basic anxiety. And I finally, after a number of 2x4s to the side of the head, kind of turned toward it and used a resource that I find really helpful. I went to the dentist this week, and I didn't go to the dentist for a really long time. When I was due for my last checkup, I was actually I was away for like 6 weeks, And then the pandemic came and I didn't go because I just didn't want to risk it. And then I didn't go because I just didn't want to. And then I didn't go because I was starting to feel some tooth pain. I kept putting it off. And it was interesting because I feel some sensitivity for a few days, and I would get worried and anxious, and then it would disappear. And then finally, I got the second Moderna shot, and I thought, well, okay, now I need a few more weeks for this to be effective, so I'll wait a little bit longer. Then I went through another round of pain and discomfort, and I thought, finally, okay, I got to make the call. Now, what's interesting is I love my dentist. If you're looking for someone in Northern Virginia, Google gentle dental care. What I love about the office is it's all women. And you just walk through the door and there's this wonderful, caring, estrogen-filled office. Dr. Anuja Parikh and her staff are awesome. So I knew I was in good hands, but I was so anxious around what's going on with my teeth. And I was pretty convinced that that I was going to have some major dental work ahead of me. And so as we went into cleaning and, doing the x-rays, and I always get a subtle gag reflex around having the x-ray things in my mouth. With the cleaning, I went to my resource state, which is my hands. I really don't like having my teeth worked on. And my mind tends to fixate on the unpleasant. But when I remember my hands feel fine, that allows me to re-soften again. And it becomes a really interesting thing because I do this all the time when I'm at the dentist. Is I just keep saying, wow, my hands feel great. And that kind of allows me to kind of like move through it. And so as it turns out, after x-rays and all that, everything was fine. And I got some sensitizing toothpaste, or toothpaste for sensitive teeth or something like that. And there was so much relief that I actually turned to face the anxiety and make that call. And then paradoxically, I recently saw a physical therapist about some other issues I've got going on. I messed up my elbow from kayaking and it's affected my grip. I have some neck pain that's kind of related to my migraines. And guess what? I have a chronically tight medial pterygoid muscle in my jaw. And this affects my jaw, my core, my neck, my muscles, and is directly related to all the tooth pain I was feeling. So now I'm sticking a finger in my mouth and doing pressure points on that muscle. And I'm beginning to feel some relief in my body. So that was a long autobiographical story of my mouth. But what I'm really trying to share here is that turning toward the anxiety can be so powerful. When I not only turn toward my anxiety around getting my teeth checked, with all my hallucinations around how much dental work I had ahead of me, not only did I find out I'm okay, but I also found out something else that was triggering this pain and a lot of other unpleasantness. So turning to face anxiety is really, really powerful and really can be incredibly rewarding. There was so much below the line of awareness that I wasn't even aware of. But it's not without its challenges. We have to be aware when you feel pain, when you feel anxiety, when you feel fear, to be aware when it's too much. So the resource state, feeling my hands, is a way I work with the dentist, but it's also a way I work with physical pain. My hands feel fine. And as you explore more, and there's so much more to share about working with anxiety and pain, finding this inner resource state can be so, so helpful. Where don't you feel the anxiety? Can you keep your attention there? And classically in trauma work, For people who experience a lot of severe trauma, like the tip of the nose, the earlobes, there are fewer nerve endings. For some people, it's the feet, the belly. Finding a somatic kind of home base that feels neutral or maybe even pleasant allows you to kind of be with, either just to bear the anxiety or the fear, or maybe even have it as a resource state when you're investigating it. Again, there's so much more, and I encourage you to explore more along the realms of somatic experiencing and some of the really beautiful trauma therapies that are being developed now. So fear, when you experience fear and anxiety and you look inside, it's very direct, it's very immediate. And another approach is to explore the thoughts that are associated with fear and anxiety. And someone said the mind is like a bad neighborhood. You don't want to go there alone. And I think the mind is kind of like that. Fear, false evidence appearing real. It's always the result of an unquestioned past imagined as a future. Well, I've experienced this in the past, so it's got to happen in the future. So much of our anxiety is future based. I'm going to suffer. I'm not going to have enough money. I'm going to be alone. And this is where you can explore the thoughts and the beliefs that are associated with the stories that you have in your mind. I was exploring with someone about her situation in life. She was in a pretty rough situation, pretty unhappy, a lot of anxiety. Her marriage was unstable. There were financial issues. They had 3 kids, one in college, 2 in high school, one with special needs. She gave up on her career a long time ago to take care of all the kids, but in particular her special needs child. And as it looked like her marriage wasn't going to pull through, you can imagine the anxiety against survival, fear of losing control, fear of losing affection, attention, and love. And as we talked, she said, "I'm stuck and I am doomed." So we use this as a springboard for some investigation. And if you're not familiar with the work of Byron Katie, it's a wonderful example of a technology for working with thoughts and beliefs. And I asked her a question. I said, "Is it true that you're stuck and that you're doomed?" And she responded immediately. She said, "Absolutely. Look at the evidence." Now, what I find in investigating beliefs around fear and anxiety is when we first examine a belief, like feeling fear and doom, feeling stuck and doomed, the first response is always absolutely. I believe it, so it's got to be true. So we have to nail ourselves to the wall. And so I did. I said, "So do you absolutely know that's true? Absolutely?" And she said, "Well, maybe not, but it sure feels that way." And so we explored this. So, I said, "So here's this thought. It's not absolutely true, but there are times when you believe it. And when you think that thought, what's it like on the inside?" And she closed her eyes, kind of turned her awareness inward, and she said, "I feel sick." She kind of doubled over. She felt weak. She felt nauseous. And again, in this practice of RAIN, to recognize, to ask if you can allow, and then to investigate. As she sat with this weak, nauseous feeling, she realized, she said, I've always looked to my husband to be my savior. My whole life, I've looked outside myself for guidance and for strength. And now that this is going to work out, I feel absolutely hopeless. So we explored what it was like just to bring a little bit of loving compassion to that. Some empathy, some compassion. And she sat there for a long time. Very, very hard to bring kindness and compassion to that. But over some time, there was a bit of a shift. She felt a little more ease, a little bit less sick. So then I asked her kind of the samurai sword question. The first is that belief true? The second, what's it like inside when you believe it? And then I asked her, regarding this thought that you're stuck and you're doomed, who are you without that thought? And she sat up and she had a stunned look on her face and she said, I have no idea. So we investigated that. What was it like to have no idea? And then she started to relax. Her face became kind of unlined and sort of smoothed out. And she felt a glimpse of who she might be without that core thought, that core belief that she was stuck and that she was doomed. Now, as you can imagine, she had a lot of work to do. But when it's possible, when you find yourself caught in fear and in anxiety, and when you can make the shift from threat to opportunity, when it feels right, you can take some time to really ask yourself, at the very core of this, what am I believing? And this takes time to kind of unravel kind of the core belief. I find quite often, for me at least, it has to do with not feeling worthy, not being good enough, a sense there's something wrong with me. You can take some time to really ask yourself, is it true? Here's what Byron Katie said. She said, if you're afraid, find the core belief and ask yourself, is it true that I need to be fearful in this situation? What is actually happening right now physically? Where is my body? What do I see? She goes on to say, impersonalizing our stories gives us an opportunity to look at circumstances more objectively and determine our responses to what life brings. Believing our untrue thoughts is a good way to scare ourselves to death. I'm aware of the time. We've only a few more minutes, so we won't have time to do a kind of a full reflection. But again, this might be a really helpful resource for yourself. Take some time to sense the core belief. Ask yourself if it's absolutely true, and just look for a crack in the wall. And then inquire, what is it like when I believe this? And in particular, look to the felt sense. Look to how that thought, how that belief lives in your nervous system. Kind of the tendrils of how it's like a software program kind of installed in your body. And then you can ask yourself, who am I without this thought? And then listen carefully. And you may get a glimpse. You may get a sense of spaciousness. And that glimpse is enough to begin a shift. What I found quite often for myself is that when I encounter when I do this investigation, something where I feel some fear and some anxiety, and I kind of get that glimpse. Of course, the old programming comes back in. Someone said it's like, when we're kids, we're these hard drives without virus protection. And so all these viruses, all these untrue beliefs install themselves. And when we sort of see them for what they are, there can be that sense of glimpse and release, but they kind of want to reinstall themselves. So what I've noticed is when I can do this work and I find an old thought, an old fear arising, that there's something inside when I'm mindful. I can say, like, wait a minute, we spent some time together and I know who I am without you. It can be a very powerful way to explore fear. And again, so much of our fear is future oriented. It's anticipating, hallucinating what might happen. Some of this is healthy, some not so much. But reminding ourselves that right now I'm fine. In this moment I'm okay can help you to make this shift from threat to opportunity mode. I really got carried away here. There's a whole other 25% of this talk, which I'm not going to be able to get to. But I will follow up, which is another really, really cool practice that you might find helpful. So why don't we do, in the next few minutes, let's do a little closing meditation. I'll share a short little reading at the end. So if you like, you can close your eyes. You might just take a few moments to slow down and deepen your breath. And can you sense this element of fear and anxiety that's healthy? That's part of your consciousness looking out for you. It's here as an ally for you to feel safe. It's drawing your attention to things that may be threats and opportunities. And you might sense how in your life that there is an element of fear and anxiety that may be a little more chronic, the hypervigilance. When you lose your capacity to disengage and to again find presence and source. And you may notice as well, there are times in your life when fear and anxiety moves into a sense of helplessness. And with this, the sense of either feeling paralyzed inside or wanting to disassociate or lost in reactive patterns. Just sensing the possibility of moving your nervous system from threat to opportunity. And finding a way to be present where you can investigate when it feels right of how this lives on the inside, how it lives in the mind. And sensing this power of pausing, this power of stepping back. Reflecting on these following words from Wendell Berry. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the middle of the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's life may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come to the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought or grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. As you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And as you're ready, you can open your eyes. May you, in your own way, find that which brings you into inner peace. That your cup might fill to overflowing, and that you might respond to the challenges of your life with wisdom and with a full heart. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. Many, many blessings.